All right, so I do quite well in school, and over the past few years in university, I've developed and built the habits that have allowed me to not only perform well in my studies, but also enjoy the process a whole lot more. But recently, I've noticed that I haven't been quite enjoying it as much as I used to. I'm not quite as motivated to sit down and do the work, and I don't enjoy the work as much when I'm doing it either. And it's not just, my studies that I've been noticing things like this. I find it harder to sit down and read, or I find it harder to, just sit by myself on the bus, or a bunch of other like small little things like this. Generally, I've just been finding these less stimulating environments a little bit harder, a little bit more unenjoyable to be in. And I've been trying to figure out where this has been coming from because, I never used to have these problems. I used to always enjoy sitting down and doing the work. I used to always, feel motivated to do the hard things, to, read the book instead of going on social media, or to just be okay with being bored for a period of time, or just to be able to feel motivated to sit down and do some work. And so over the past few months, I've just been noticing this, and I've become especially aware of it when school started for me, a couple weeks back. And so I'm trying to think, where has this came from? What has changed over the course of, 3-4 months that has, changed my whole like mindset, my whole like how much I enjoy school, how motivated I am to do the work, or how easy it is for me to pick up a book and read it, or do any of these sort of things. And I've noticed, the one thing that has changed is that my social media use increased over the course of 3 months. So my social media use is typically very minimal, but sometime earlier on in the summer, I decided, maybe it was subconscious, maybe it was conscious, I was going to start using Instagram more. And so, it's 10 minutes here, 10 minutes there. And it's not much. It's just filling little gaps in the day. It's, you're on the bus, you pick up the phone, you go on Instagram. You're waiting for class to start, you pick up your phone, you go on Instagram. Or you consume some sort of media, or some sort of information, right? And for me, this was mostly educational media. Like, I don't really consume other content. Most of my stuff is to do with fitness or mindset, or any of these things. And I thought, these are creators that I enjoy, that I feel like I'm getting something out of. But here's the thing: 2 minutes here, 2 minutes there. These add up, okay? And even at the end of the day, even if it's only if you only have spent 20, 25 minutes, maybe 30 minutes on Instagram or some other social media platform, even if it's educational, okay, that 20, 30 minutes a day affected me a whole lot more than I thought it was, okay? Because you might think, okay, it's only 20 minutes, it's only 30 minutes. And if it was only that period of time, okay, that's fine. If there was no, ongoing negative effects that came from, consuming 20 minutes of media or 30 minutes of media, that's okay. But I was noticing more and more and more that I was not feeling motivated to do school. Now I don't enjoy studying as much. Now I don't enjoy reading as much. Now I can't, sit on a 20-minute bus ride without feeling the urge to, pull out my phone. Like, these are all things that stem from that 20, 30 minutes a day, okay? And so in this video, I just want to walk through that and show how, even consuming media in, small doses can negatively impact the enjoyment of the things you're doing in a much broader sense, in a much larger sense than you think. It's not just the time sink, because for some people, the time sink is minimal, but there's so many more negative effects that come from stimulating content. And that negative effect might outweigh, any positives that you get from consuming, short form content that might be inspirational, might be, motivational, might be educational to an extent, right? All this time that you spend when you're slightly bored and you feel the urge to go on Instagram or go on some other short form content, and you decide to consume that, every single time you do that, you are just conditioning your brain to not be comfortable with a little bit of understimulation. And by doing so, you ruin any ability that you have to sit down and study, or to not be just completely bored during a lecture, or any of these things, okay? When you consume even, small amounts of short form content, overstimulating content, you're conditioning your brain to just not enjoy, everyday life as much. And that includes your studying, that includes, reading, that includes maybe going to the gym, sitting on the bus, your drive home, all of these things, okay? Every little thing that's not as stimulating becomes that much more unenjoyable. And so that's really what I want to emphasize in this video, because realistically, let's say your goal is to study better, okay? You struggle with studying, you can't really focus, you get distracted easily, you don't feel motivated at all to study, you don't really actually even like studying at all, okay? Let's say this is the situation you're in, okay? You might try all these different productivity techniques. You might try, setting a timer, sitting down in a location with no distractions, there's nobody here. You have every reason to be able to sit down and study, okay? But if your brain has been, conditioned to just dislike the scenario, to just feel so uncomfortable with being, slightly understimulated, you are not going to be able to study. You're not going to be able to enjoy studying. You're not going to be able to sit down and push through like 2 hours of something when every part of your brain is saying that I don't want to do this thing, okay? You're fighting a constant uphill battle when your brain is used to this overstimulation, okay? And so if you want to be able to study better, if you want to be able to enjoy, a nice walk in the park better, if you want to enjoy reading more, if you want to be able to read, if you want to be able to sit down and feel motivated to do work, if you want to enjoy anything more that isn't like, a 100 out of 100 stimulation like short form content, then you need to bring down the amount of short form content that you consume, okay? In general, as a broad, overstatement, I've talked about this in a whole another video, but any bad habit you do, okay, typically has some element of overstimulation or a high amount of stimulation, okay? And so when you do that bad habit, any subsequent good habit that you try to do that's, related to that becomes so much more harder, so much more unenjoyable, okay? The example I always use is, let's say you always eat, sweets, over-processed, junk food, okay? Let's say you always eat that food. You're not going to enjoy as much sitting down and eating a nice, whole food meal because you're so used to this overstimulating, sweets, donuts, chocolate, like, sitting down and eating, some eggs and steak or something won't taste as good to you because you're not used to that, less stimulating food. But if you had not consumed all that overstimulating food, all that, junk food, okay, then eating that, clean, healthier meal is going to be like, wow, this is good. Like anybody would want that meal, right? And so again, generally, when you have, something that is highly stimulating, it makes a related, lower stimulating activity a lot less enjoyable, okay? And so again, if you want to make studying a whole lot easier, the first thing you should be doing isn't looking for tips and tricks that are going to like slingshot you into the lead. The first thing you should be doing are taking off these things that are, slowing you down, these like chains that you're like dragging along with you, okay? And so that comes from reducing the stimulation that you consume, reducing the content that you consume outside of your study hours, right? Because it's not just the time that you actually spend, scrolling on social media. It's the effects that come from that. If you're always used to, picking up your phone when you're just slightly bored, okay? You get to class like 2 minutes early and your friends aren't here, so you pull out your phone for like 2 minutes. So that's a reasonable thing that 99% of people will do, but you're just conditioning your brain to desire that stimulation when you have the slightest ounce of boredom, okay? And so, what's going to happen when you go to sit down to study, okay? That's, again, you're going to have the slightest bit of boredom, the slightest bit of, understimulation. And so what are you going to do? Okay, you're so used to always just pulling out the phone. So what are you going to do in this situation? You're going to procrastinate and you're going to pull out your phone and you're just not going to want to sit down to do the work. So again, if you're struggling with motivation to study, if you're struggling with enjoying studying, the first step is, let's limit that stimulation. Let's try a week without social media, okay? You don't need to do this permanent. You can, take a big step back and then wean in and find like the perfect spot for you, okay? Because there's still some value there. Consuming content isn't a wholly, worthless activity, especially if you're consuming longer form content, which isn't as stimulating. There can always be that value there. There can always be that education there. But, we can start by taking that step back. Just try it 1 week, okay? And I'm sure by the end of the week, the next time you go to sit down and, do some studying, there's going to be a lot less friction there. You're going to be able to just sit down and get started because your brain isn't used to immediately wanting to, leave that little bit of under stimulation. You're okay with that stimulation. Every time you choose not to pull out your phone and go on Instagram, you are saying, hey, it's okay. I can handle this period of time without my brain being, like hyper stimulated. So take that into consideration. And so what does this look like, right? I gave you one option, which you can do, which is what I'm doing right now, which is just taking that week off social media. But there's other things we can do too to just, reduce the amount of stimulation that we are intaking at any time, right? Because again, we just want to be comfortable and be able to be okay with having, not maximum stimulation all the time, okay? And so let's say you're taking the bus home, okay? If you have a short bus ride, if you have, a 20-minute bus ride, you can just sit there, okay? What's stopping you from just being, the one person out of 50 people on the bus not on your phone? There's nothing that is stopping you from, being that person. And I say this because, I just said, let's take the week off social media, but I'm treating this as a different thing because it's not just the act of social media. It's just any little bit of stimulation, You might not even be checking anything, worthwhile. Going on your phone might be just so habitual to you that you won't even go on social media. You'll just, open your phone and check the weather or something, okay? And it doesn't need to be like that. You're just so starved for stimulation, so like, hungry for that stimulation that you're literally going to get stimulation from checking the time or checking the weather because it's just, the slightest little bit, okay? And so we just want to be avoiding this, right? Because again, the stimulation is what leads to you enjoying the other aspects of your life less. So another example, the next time you go to eat a meal, let's say you're at home, do you really need to, put the TV on, to put a show on when you're eating? You already have a plate of food in front of you. There's some element of stimulation there. Do you really need to be double stimulating your brain by, the food you're intaking and the show you're watching or the TV you're watching? Like it's okay to just sit back and, enjoy the thing that's in front of you, okay? You don't need to be constantly being stimulated by, more and more and more and more, because not only does it make the, less stimulating things less enjoyable, but the more you, condition your brain to want these higher stimulating things, it's just going to spiral upwards and get worse with how much stimulation you are constantly wanting, because you're always going to want that, little bit more. And so just be aware of this, right? Another thing you can do, can you study without music? Are you able to study without music? Because, I know I study with music a lot as a tool to block out other noise, because I prefer to have some slow study music in my ear than hearing conversations that is more stimulating and more distracting. But are you able to study without it? Can you, let's say you don't have those distractions there. Let's say you're studying in a quiet place. Are you able to just put the headphones away and just study in silence? I'm not saying you always need to do it, but you should be able to, right? These are all signs of, if you can't sit down and study for, an hour without having music, well, we might just be, just too used to that external stimulation. And so, these are all ways that we can bring down our, total stimulation during a day, so that when it comes down to, doing the slower tasks that, we would like to enjoy, you would like to enjoy the studying, because, that studying probably needs to be done. It's probably something you want to do, okay? And you would like to enjoy it and feel motivated to do it. That's how we do it, okay? It's by bringing down, all this stimulation that's probably not good stimulation, right? Because obviously not all activities that stimulate your brain are, bad, right? Hanging out with your friends, you might be laughing, you might be having fun. Like, that's going to be a fun activity, okay? And I'm not saying not to do that, but I'm saying to stray away from the ones that are highly stimulating and not that rewarding anyways, right? Like short form content, because we want to have a net positive effect, and cutting out friends because it's a stimulating activity is not going to be a net positive, right? If you cut out your friends and never hang out with friends and never do anything fun, that's not going to be net positive. But when you cut out, a good chunk of your social media, and now you all of a sudden enjoy studying more, that is a net positive, right? Because social media, realistically, was it doing too much for you actually in terms of having a good time? Do you think back, oh man, I really remember 5 years ago, I watched that one reel and it was awesome, and I loved that. That really just won't happen. If I filmed you while you're watching Instagram reels, you wouldn't, as a external viewer, you wouldn't be able to tell. I wouldn't be able to tell that you were having a good time, okay? And so again, we want to have a net positive, okay? So let's take out, the stimulation that's bad, that doesn't actually feel that rewarding, that doesn't actually feel that good in the long run, okay? Because that enables us to enjoy, the things that we want to enjoy, studying, school, nature, whatever it is, reading a book. We want to enjoy these things more. And so we do that by cutting out the bad stimulation. And this leads to my next point, which is just we've been talking about how it's okay to just, take a step back, not be constantly overstimulated. And, I want to emphasize that more, that being bored can be good, okay? Just because there's time to fill, just because there's 2 minutes, before a professor comes into to the lecture hall, or just because there's 2 minutes while you're waiting for the bus, that doesn't mean that this time needs to be filled. Being bored is okay. In the shower, do you have your phone with you? No, okay? You go in the shower and you have a shower. But would you say that you're bored in the shower? You probably wouldn't, because even though you're not doing anything, your brain still thinks, your brain still has thoughts. And this can be a pretty good thing, actually. A lot of insights, a lot of good thoughts come to you when you're bored. It's one time, it was a few years back, actually, and we had just written a thermodynamics exam. And so I was talking to the guy next to me the next day, and he was talking to me about the exam, and he was saying that, he couldn't figure out the problem during the actual exam, but in the shower later that night, he just had this big epiphany, and the whole solution, he had it all in his brain, okay? And so, this is things that happen when you give your brain the chance to just breathe, when you're not just constantly throwing stimulation at it, okay? Because how is your brain going to, think of things if you're just always, receiving information, receiving, stimulation from other external things? You're never going to give it the chance to actually just do its own thing and produce its own ideas, right? So it's okay, to be bored. Also, when you're bored and when you don't have the, going on the phone, going on the social media as an escape, well, it forces you to take better action, all right? Let's say I'm at the gym, okay? And let's say I usually go on my phone between sets. I don't, and I never have. But let's say I do, okay? If I always am used to going on my phone between sets, okay, I'm just cutting down the amount of interactions that I'm going to have in the gym by, 100-fold, okay? But let's say I don't go on my phone between my sets, okay? And instead I say, hey, this is a rule, I don't do it. I put my phone down and I don't touch it, okay? Let's say that's the situation. Now instead, okay, my set ends, okay? Phone down. What do? Okay, I have 2, 3, 5 minutes of time in between my sets, okay? And what am I gonna do? Well, maybe I'll sit there and I'll think and I'll listen to music, but maybe, if I see some guy next to me benching a ton of weight, maybe I'm gonna go over and talk to him. Maybe I'm gonna go talk to my friend across the gym that I see, okay? So when you're removing the escapes, you force yourself to take better action. being bored will force yourself to take, the better action. So again, those are like two more bonuses to reducing the amount of stimulation that you're intaking, overall, okay? Not only is it the time sink, which, can be minimal, cannot be minimal, depends on how much you actually consume. Not only does that overstimulation make other understimulated activities, studying, reading, anything like this, less enjoyable. That's what we talked about earlier. But also, you are depriving yourself of the insights, your brain's ability to just breathe, to just have a moment of stillness where you can just, come up with ideas on yourself. Just, let your brain do its own thing. Not only are you doing those three things, you're also, enabling yourself to always have that escape, to always have that escape to the phone, to always have that escape to that stimulation, meaning you don't, you sacrifice other opportunities. You don't take that better action of going to talk to the person next to you, of going to pick up a book and reading instead, of, going on a nice walk with your dog, okay? Because if you're always used to the overstimulation, then you use it as an escape. And all these opportunities, making a new friend maybe in the gym, or, finding a new insight in a book, or, finding something that helps you in your life, okay? All of this stuff you've missed now, okay? Because you're so used to just always escaping constantly to some form of stimulation, overstimulation, okay? So again, let's try to mitigate the amount of short form content that we consume, because the short form content is, the biggest culprit here. It doesn't need to be forever, okay? It doesn't need to be, permanent, but are you able to just, go a period of time without it? Because I'm sure you're going to start to notice the difference, because I know that I have in just a few days. It's really nice to just, be okay with that little bit of, boredom, that little bit of, stillness. Don't take that as a negative sign. Take it as a sign that, hey, okay, this is good. This means that I will be enjoying, the rest of my time. This means that I'll be enjoying my studies more. This means that I'll enjoy, going to the gym more. This means that I'll enjoy taking my dog for a walk more. This means that I'll enjoy reading more. Take any bit of boredom or any little bit of time where you feel a little bit understimulated and you feel the urge to reach your phone, but you don't. Take that as a sign and be like, okay, is there a little bit of discomfort now? Yes, but overall, this is a good sign. This means that I'm, operating as a healthy human being. This means that I'm going to feel more motivated to do school. This means that I'm going to do better in school. This means that I'm going to do better in all the different aspects of my life that I want to do better at. And so just take it as a good sign. So thank you for watching. I hope this video has helped you.